In this video, I will be talking about moderators. I will be looking at when they should actually be measured in your experiment. This is a very important question, and here, before I cover this topic, I want to have a distinction. What I've been showing to you before was pretty much the conceptual framework, right? Because this is how we are conceptualizing research. However, your real conceptual framework as it would appear in your publication, in your dissertation, would look more like this. It would not have colors, which I use here for educational purposes. It would be more black and white, and you would describe it in a more simple way. You would say your appeal is kinder schema versus control group. Then you would state your dependent variable, and then you would show the hypothesis. This is your conceptual framework. Something which looks like this, which has your coefficients, your statistical results, that's your empirical model. Why? Because it has statistical results. Some scholars like to show them in their papers, some only show conceptual framework, some show both. So you need to see what is more conventional in your area of research, what your supervisors want from you, and what most of the journals in your area are publishing. I thought I would make this distinction because it's very important to not use a lot of colors that may not fly. Now, to make all of this work, you need to collect your data, which means you need to develop a research protocol for your experiment. And I have already started talking about it in another video on this channel where I talked about the sequence of questions to be asked, and it was covered in the manipulation check video where I also talked about attention check and conscientiousness checks. And this was the sequence of questions that I've displayed in that video. Now I'm sticking with a scenario of having an online experiment. And let's say you have your introduction, you have your manipulation, then you measure dependent variable, then you measure attention checks and manipulation checks appear at the end of the survey. Then you thank, debrief your participants. And here you also measure other variables that you need, age, sociodemographics, whatever you need. Now, where would you actually measure your moderators? They are potentially individual consumer differences, something that varies between individuals. So where should it actually be measured? Now, welcome to another world of big debate in marketing discipline, where a lot of papers has been published on where moderators should be actually measured. So let's look into that aspect. Now, this is the work that I really like. It's by Sheagley and Clifford. They published it in 2025. What they've done literature review of various different studies, and they looked at what researchers were doing. And the questions they raised were, where should you collect your moderators? Should you actually do it sometime before you conduct your experiment? For example, you have a panel provider, and maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the actual experiment, you administer and measure your moderator. That applies to situations when you have a panel provider. Very often we cannot do that. We run our experiments in one shot, one opportunity, right? And then the question is, where should we place it? Another question which Sheagley and Clifford asked was, should you actually measure it before you expose your participants to a treatment? And we would do that to avoid post-treatment bias, because responses on your moderator may be impacted by the manipulation. And the question is, would you measuring your moderator here prime participants to respond in a particular way when you expose them to your manipulation, right? So there is a lot of questions here. Then they asked, well, should you actually measure it after the treatment, before the dependent variable? Should you actually measure it after your dependent variable to avoid biasing your dependent variable? Or should you measure it at the end of your experiment once you've collected all your attention and manipulation checks? So as you can see, there's a big debate there as well. So what Sheagley and Clifford did in their 2025 paper, they ran a number of simulations and a number of experiments, including panel responses data and measuring different ways of collecting data to see whether it has any impact on the responses. So not to torture you, I'll give you their findings straight away. They found that there was no difference between measuring your moderators sometime before the actual exposure if you rely on panel providers, and let's say you can collect data 2 or 3 weeks before or even a month before the actual exposure. They also found no difference between this and this approach if you measure your moderators before the manipulation. And at the moment, most of the literature, and this is what Sheagley and Clifford also argue in favor of, is leaning towards measuring your moderators before your treatment, before your manipulation. So the recommendation in literature now is not to do it here, not to do it here, not to do it here, but try to do it either sometime before the actual treatment, before the experiment, if you have the luxury of dealing with a panel provider and collect data in several ways, or you would do it before your manipulation because they didn't find any biasing effects on the dependent variables. Now, if you're interested, please read this paper. They ran a number of experiments and simulations. It's very interesting, and it would be good if you have a read. I hope that now you understand what a moderator is and when or where you should be measuring this. I hope you enjoyed this video and you're ready for the next one.